So I just want to, I have been saying this several times, but I want to say, although my co-editor Laurence will not be presenting today, she's here in the audience, and I wanted from the title, make it clear that I'm not the only one in this project. So let me begin. In the afterword to Writing Habits, I riff on Stephen Greenblatt by comparing archival research to the Homeric descent into the underworld, where nameless, indiscriminate masses of the deceased swarm around Odysseus after he slays the sacrificial offerings at the pit that marks the entry point to the underworld. Out of all the voices from the past that I have encountered in archives over the years, none have spoken to me with as much urgency as the English Benedictine nuns who lived in Brussels during the early 17th century and experienced lengthy spiritual quarrels that became an international scandal. I have spent the last 13 years locating, editing, and translating documents related to these disputes for an edition that is now under advanced contract at the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies, which is part of the University of Toronto Press. This task itself has been an epic one, involving the discovery and cataloging of over 1,000 manuscripts written in Latin, French, English, and Dutch, and located in Belgian, English, and Italian archives. And I've been privileged to collaborate with my co-editor, Laurence Luke Starrett, on this undertaking. It wouldn't have been possible without her. And we're almost ready now to submit the manuscript for peer review. Around 200,000 words in length, it contains nearly 100 primary documents, which will be supplemented eventually by a digital edition of additional documents, as you can see on the screen, an additional 57. So today I'm going to read excerpts from this manuscript, telling the story of the Brussels Benedictines through the voices of the participants themselves, and publicly sharing many of these accounts for the first time. I should note that I will be reading English translations of all documents written in foreign languages. So our story begins in 1597, when Mary Percy arrived on the continent with the intention of joining a convent on foreign soil. Since both Catholicism and monasteries were illegal in England, she was following in the footsteps of other English women who had professed at Flemish and French convents. Yet Mary Percy was not like other English women. Her father, Thomas Percy, the Earl of Northumberland, had been executed in 1572 for leading the Northern Uprising, and the Catholic community viewed him as a martyr. As English Jesuits in Spanish Flanders realized, the Percy name was prestigious enough, and her dowry large enough, to serve as a basis for an exciting new venture, the establishment of the first post-Reformation convent for English women on the continent. This institution would provide a female parallel to the English seminaries that had been set up on the continent to provide a steady flow of priests who could minister to English Catholics and work toward the conversion of the nation. An English convent would provide spiritual labor toward this same end through prayer. English Jesuits thus formulated a plan for the monastery, secured its initial members, arranged funding, handled logistical arrangements in Brussels and Rome, and recruited a steady stream of postulates who were deeply devoted to Ignatian piety. Since the Jesuits could not serve as the house's ordinary or official confessors, they acted as spiritual guides and extraordinary confessors. When Percy was elected as abbess in 1616, the Brussels Benedictines were the premier English convent on the continent. Not only was the house highly esteemed among English Catholics abroad and in their homeland, but it was also on a sound financial footing. In 1618, Percy herself wrote to the Superior General of the Society of Jesus to request that the Jesuits continue to assist the house. Noting the Jesuits' indefatigable labors, she observes, "We say that this is your congregation," basically your convent, "for from you, by divine beneficence, the first foundations were laid. Through you also, it has grown into a body that is not little. And finally, through your help, which as we hope will never be lacking to us, it strives after that perfection of spiritual life, which shall bring forth entrance into that celestial kingdom of God and the saints." Yet Percy soon took a dimmer view of Jesuit priests. She did not get along well with the convent's official confessor, a secular priest named Robert Chambers. After he threatened to leave in 1620, Percy received an anonymous letter that purported to recount events at a gathering held in England specifically to determine how to fix the situation in the convent, which had become so urgent that some participants compared the convent to the ruins of Troy. In the words of the primary speaker, Percy was rather like an unjust usurper or tyrant than like a true and religious superior. And that's just a small taste of the many things he says about her. The letter writer patronizingly instructed Percy on how to improve her governance, while implicitly threatening that she would be deposed or required to govern with a co-abbess if she did not comply. An empty threat, as only her superior, the Archbishop of Mecklenburg-Brussels, could exact such penalties. Percy blamed the Jesuits for this insulting letter, and she soon spurned them in favor of a young secular priest named Francis Ward, who was appointed in 1622 as confessor of the house in order to aid Chambers. As Percy reported in an initial letter to Jacobus Boonen, the Archbishop, Ward was still young and had only recently graduated from the seminary, but his sobriety, modesty, and excellent parentage all recommended him for the job. However, Ward's youth proved a distraction, and even worse, he took it upon himself to give the spiritual exercises, a meditative retreat that is a key component of Jesuit spirituality. In an effort to remove Ward, the Jesuits and their allies accused him of overfamiliarity with his penitents. Lucy Knatchbull reported that at the sacristy window, there is talk, taking, and kissing of hands, and when they complain of not being well, he in recreation must feel their pulse. Then her brother, a Jesuit named John Norton, informed the Archbishop in October 1623 that Ward was planning to consummate his relationship with a young nun named Mary Phillips. In Norton's words, "This weak, jeopardized girl wretchedly faints, melts, and burns with his love, nor is she able to think anything about God, religion, or herself, but her whole mind is occupied with him. And he, meanwhile, with his flatteries and amorous conversations, kindles the fire of lust." Just 5 days later, Ward had been expelled, and Norton reported to Boonen with some satisfaction that there was a great wailing and weeping from some nuns, since they could not hold back tears at the table or in the common company of the sisters. In 1624, Knatchbull and several other pro-Jesuit nuns would leave Brussels to found a new English Benedictine monastery in Gand, aided by her brother. Tensions eased after the departure, but Chambers left as well, and for the next 4 years, the convent was unable to secure an official confessor who pleased the pro-Jesuit nuns. For example, Robert Blundeston left in July 1628 after Jesuit priests accused him of having a sexual relationship with another priest, while also taunting him for a perceived lack of learning. Although Blundeston was a doctor of divinity and taught Greek at the English College in Douay, one Jesuit priest said to his face and in the presence of several nuns that Blundeston's Latin was inferior to that of Prioress Agatha Wiseman, who, to be fair, had gained a limited reputation in Europe for her Latin poetry, but still. Eager to quell these disturbances, in late September 1629, Archbishop Boonen provided the convent with an official confessor whose credentials appeared impeccable on the surface. Anthony Champney, a doctor of sacred theology, was the vice president of the English College at Douay, and he came with sterling references from English Catholics abroad and in the home country. Champney's initial reception in the house was positive. Mary Persons, the niece of a prominent Jesuit, wrote the Archbishop on behalf of the house to convey their thanks. "We gladly accept the good Father that you have sent for our confessor. We thank you most humbly for having cast your eyes upon such a worthy and capable person." Yet by late January 1629, 17 nuns out of 55 wrote Boonen to request Champney's removal on a technicality, that they had not received sufficient information about Champney's virtue and piety before his appointment, as the house's statutes dictated. So what had happened? As the nuns explained, Champney and the Jesuits have been held and known to be contrary and opposed in judgments and opinions. In fact, Champney had been a well-known foe of the Jesuits for decades, and he was a vital participant in much earlier debates over whether Jesuits or secular priests were in charge of missionary activity in England. Champney had appealed to Rome in order to protest the imposition of a pro-Jesuit archpriest as governor of the secular clergy. And in 1603, he signed the Protestation of Allegiance, pledging allegiance to Queen Elizabeth as long as she expelled the Jesuits and mandated religious tolerance. Champney had likely been appointed as vice president of Douay College in order to root out pro-Jesuit sentiment there, and it seems that Archbishop Boonen and others hoped he would perform similar work at the Brussels convent. The Jesuits, however, recognized this threat and acted swiftly. Percy's supporters would later allege that this business remained in a good and calm state without any complaint against the confessor for 2 months or less, until Reverend Father William Baldwin, S.J., came to the said monastery and talked secretly and extensively with several nuns. From this moment, everything was found to take a turn toward the worse. For his part, Baldwin, who was involved in the gunpowder plot, and had earlier provided spiritual and logistical assistance to the house, denied rousing any suspicion against Champney, and gave this account of his address to the nuns. The sight of them called to mind how fully several women had been called by God to enter into monastic life on that very day years before. In other words, back to the beginning of the convent. He's talking about the first nuns to profess there. Moreover, they ought to remember with what ardor and zeal for piety and religion those women had conducted those first beginnings, and how outstandingly they had advanced those very efforts during the same 12 years that I was present as a witness. But as far as what pertained to me, they should know most certainly that I had the same disposition to the monastery and the same zeal for its benevolence now, as I once did when I lived in Brussels. Therefore, everyone should bestow their care so that in preserving their rule and statutes, they might be united as closely as possible with God, the author of good things. Baldwin commented sarcastically, as if I would have had the intention of destroying this religious community, which formerly I both supported as it began and promoted as it grew with whatever assistance I could, unless by chance to inculcate observance of the statutes which shatter the monastery's peace. And yet this call to remembrance of the monastery's origins would certainly have incited the nuns against Champney, because that first ardor and zeal had been supported and kindled by the Jesuits, whom Champney opposed. Baldwin thus implicitly reminded the house of its earliest pro-Jesuit fever, and his call to preserve their rules and statutes supplied the roadmap for their attempts to remove Champney. I will therefore pause for a moment to examine the House's statutes and explain how their interpretation offered the basis for the controversies that ensued. There are three relevant clauses. First, the statutes mandate that the Lady Abbess must see that all go to one ghostly father, whom the bishop shall appoint them for that purpose, if the number will permit it. Otherwise, she with her convent shall choose another approved by the ordinary, that is the bishop, unto whom that part of the convent shall confess, which the abbess shall think good to appoint. The statutes also dictate that the monastery must have for their ghostly fathers such as are modest, prudent, and learned. And first, the convent must be well informed of their sufficiency, virtue, and honesty before they are to be admitted. Based on these two clauses, Champney's opponents argued that candidates for confessor were subject to a vote from the convent after it received sufficient information about the candidate. However, Percy and her supporters argued that the official confessor was appointed by the archbishop, while any secondary confessors were chosen by the convent and then approved by the archbishop. Finally, the statutes note that when nuns profess, they were required to sign a statement that they will not admit any greater liberty than the rule and statutes will permit. The anti-Champney party cited this clause in order to support their disobedience, according to this reasoning. Because the convent had not been sufficiently informed about Champney, and it had not voted to accept him as confessor, he was illegitimately imposed on the convent, and the nuns were duty-bound to reject this imposition as an unlawful modification of the statutes. It's worth noting, however, that this same section of the statutes also gave the archbishop the sole authority to interpret and modify the statutes, and the paper signed by the nuns at profession indicated that they will accept of any reformation proceeding from the bishop conformable and agreeable to the rule and statutes. So in the disputes that followed, this was the crux of the matter. Who had the power to appoint the confessor? And more importantly, to interpret the statutes. The first stage of the controversy played out over 1629 and early 1630, as Champney's opponents sought to rally their supporters in England and abroad. By the end of February, an unknown English Catholic was writing to ask the father of a Brussels nun to use his credit with the archbishop so that, quote, our children, sisters, and close allies who have left their country and commodities the better to serve Almighty God in that place will not be kept under such a tyrannical subjection, in which, with a very great pain in our hearts, we hear that they are. And this by a world of letters which they find means to send us, and which we cannot read or see without tears. The archbishop received missives from the secular clergy and lay people, both for and against Champney. For example, Richard Smith, the Bishop of Chalcedon, detailed Champney's accomplishments. He has borne himself and his whole life so that deservedly his works praise him at the city gates. Whether anyone would look at those private things which only have God and his companions as witnesses, or things done in public and under the eyes of the sun, among which, first of all, stand out his long labors in the English harvest, his zeal of converting souls, his endurance of prison on behalf of his faith, his books written most learnedly against heretics, and so that I might pass over the rest, the diligence which he has always brought to increasing the Catholic religion and advancing the public good with an indefatigable attempt. As the charges against Champney grew to include heresy, A group of 22 secular priests attested to the archbishop that he never met any Anglican bishop, except when, indeed, he was placed before the bishop by the royal guards as one fit to be led to jail for the Catholic faith. Meanwhile, the anti-Champney party tried to resolve the situation through other means, gradually escalating into physical secession within the monastery. In March 1629, Champney's opponents unsuccessfully petitioned the archbishop for permission to start a new monastery. And shortly thereafter, Frances Evers, a novice, fled for the Ghent Benedictines after squeezing herself through the kitchen turn, a rotating device that allowed the monastery to receive goods from the outside world without seeing anyone. A Jesuit priest defended her, according to Percy, because she had been treated so inhumanely and tyrannically among us as if she had lived amongst Turks and savages. She reported that a different Jesuit had encouraged the religious to persist bravely and with constancy in their resolution, and informed the house that, quote, we must not expect to have their assistance while our father confessor remains here, taking, for example, 2 horses belonging to a coach, one good, the other bad, though one contrary to the other and of different conditions. They would not and could not agree with him. The archbishop conducted a visitation of the house in September 1629, but that did not resolve matters, as the anti-Champney nuns refused to speak to him because they were appealing to Rome about Champney's appointment. By their own account, in a letter to Cardinal Francesco Barberini, the protector of English Catholics, Percy and the archbishop reacted violently to this appeal. When they appealed to the Holy See, which was their only refuge in such straits, some were condemned with the punishment of silence and separation. Others were shamefully thrown into prison without proof of any crime, without the consent of the chapter, and even against the form of the foresaid constitutions. Against some, the sentence of excommunication was threatened. Others, against the sacred canons, were violently subdued with fists and blows. By October 5th, 1629, the anti-Champney nuns, or appellants as they called themselves, had locked themselves in the convent's infirmary, as they complained to the Chancellor of Brabant, the highest secular legal authority in the country. We have been and are grievously oppressed and injuriously treated. To avoid the extreme violence which we have experienced from some of our adversaries, and even more so because we perceive ourselves to be under threat, we have been forced, for the defense and safety of our lives, to keep ourselves altogether enclosed in a room of the infirmary, where we are completely inconvenienced, not daring to open the door of our room, but rather choosing to endure any suffering than to venture to have our good God offended by further violence, which we have the greatest reason to fear, because they absolutely refuse, regardless of all our requests, to give us as much as a little water from the pump through our window, through which we could most conveniently and safely receive our sustenance. Percy herself was not slow to send her own complaint to Rome, in this case to the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith on December 8, 1629. She blamed the Jesuits completely, stating that, from the beginning, the fathers of the Society of Jesus have appropriated much for themselves in the governance of the whole monastery, both because they employed their labor in founding it, and because, since they are men who are well suited for undertaking enterprises and gladly occupy themselves with works of piety of this sort, they have been led with hardly any difficulty to labor in this business also. But since their mode of life would allow by no means that they manage the care of women, they have been forced to admit others, who as far as title were ordinary confessors, although nevertheless they themselves have been content not only to undertake the greatest part of this care in truth, but also they have both expected and demanded it. Thus, she concluded, although the fathers of the Society of Jesus ought to make peace and are believed to keep nuns in due obedience and subjection toward superiors, they have acted otherwise, and this is not by chance. In February 1630, the congregation ruled that the Jesuits should no longer be allowed into the monastery, one of 2 events that further exacerbated the disputes. The second event was that at the end of April 1630, Percy's supporters formally voted to censure the appellants and remove their rights of passive and active suffrage, that is, their ability to vote on matters proposed to the House and to be elected into monastic offices. At the end of August 1630, the appellants filed an official complaint with the papal nuncio of Belgium, who had been appointed by Rome to resolve the controversy. Although their complaint contains a number of allegations, I'll just focus on 2 here. First, they accused Champney of licentious speech on the basis of his sermons. And I'm going to give you these parallel versions so you can see. So theirs is on the left. On the 12th of August, a day sacred to St. Clare, in a sermon given on the denial of self-will, he objected with these words: Therefore, must a spiritual father be obeyed in all things? Hardly, since it is possible for them to order someone to sleep with them and to consent to an intimate union, which we have heard has been done by some. From this cause and another incidental occurrence which I hear has flown to your ears, I understand that there are some of you from your number who refuse to submit their consciences to a secular priest. However, I will make them blush. Only lend willing ears. They say that a priest from Doway College incited certain virgins there to render obedience to himself. Truly that he charged one of them to sleep with him. She complied with the command, and he sent her off home, deflowered and fertile with child, imposing profound silence regarding this deed. In the English language, this Champney declared these things candidly, with words that were most foul and unworthy for the ears of consecrated virgins. He delivered another sermon of this nature on the virtue of chastity, in which he fabricated a minute patchwork of all the sinners who oppose this virtue by summarizing the transgressions that occur among partners who are unequal in bed, between a husband and an unmarried woman, and vice versa, between an unmarried man and an unmarried woman, between a married or unmarried man and a religious woman, between a religious man and a religious woman, between those of the same sex, between those of different sexes on the occasion of bestiality, in every detail, lest he keep silent about the smallest circumstance, from which laborious and scandalous recapitulation the foresaid dames obtain nothing except offense and disquietude of soul, as is natural for women who have been reared from the first through and through in the school of chastity, so they had no innate knowledge of the foresaid things. Well, in a copy of the first sermon submitted by Champney to the Archbishop, there are some interesting differences in the way that this material was presented. And after having spoken many things of the necessity of obedience to superiors to prevent an objection, I made this question: is it necessary to obey our superiors in all things? And what if it happened to us, as it is said to have happened to one in times past, who had promised obedience to her ghostly father? Here, said I must tell you a thing whereat peradventure you may blush, as I myself also shall, but yet it is expedient to speak it. In your conversations, you have frequently a tale or a fable amongst you, which, were it true, as I verily think it is false, would no way become you, nor yet would it be lawful for you. For it is said amongst you that a certain Doway priest commanded a maid, his ghostly child, who had promised obedience to him, to lie with him. If the same should happen to us, inquired one of you, what, must we obey? I understand not without grief and shame that this is said frequently amongst you, not without laughter. Madam, to you it belongeth, turning his speech to the Lady Abbess, to have care to suppress and root out from amongst your children these speeches, lest they bring God's curse and indignation upon your house. For bad speeches corrupt good life and manners, saith the Holy Scripture. So Champney presents the nuns as hardly innocent, and the reference to Doway College, where he was vice president, seems to be an obvious insult to him and to secular priests. The second noteworthy complaint involves allegations that Percy caused the death of Mary Wintour, a leading member of the Appellants, and in fact, her brother had carried their appeal to Rome. As the complaint stated, and this will be lengthy, Mary Wintour, a most noble and delicate religious, whose relatives took the Lady Abbess into their care and included her in their family after her father's beheading, when she had been abandoned and deprived of all means, one whom poverty would have consumed. Wintour never received thanks for such a great favor except premature death, which took the place of a favor to her. Of their number, the appellant's number, truly she alone was feeble in health. She who was dispatched to the little cells that are situated at the top of the tower, which were exposed to the sun's reflection and burned with unbearable heat. When the illness grew stronger with miseries and afflictions, a doctor was sought. The abbess refused, so that in this way, the poor little one remained bereft of counsel. At last, when she was laboring in extreme necessity, the Lady Abbess was overcome and allowed the summoning of a doctor. Since he was ignorant of the English language, the prioress, the chief enemy of the said Mary, alone attended him. She said nothing voluntarily to the doctor about the real causes of the illness. Even so, the said doctor was an experienced man. Since he observed other signs of illness than the interpreter's words conveyed, her translation excited his suspicion. He answered that there was need of the most potent medicines. He ordered that she should enjoy freer air as she was sick. He prescribed choice foods, since common ones roused the patient's nausea. Even so, since the said abbess and prioress wished it to be so, nothing was heeded, but she suffered several times the loss of her mind while she was detained in that straitness and the summer heat. When these things did not soften hardened hearts, the sick one was fatigued by headaches. Again, she humbly petitioned that she could use the counsel of the doctor or the mother infirmarian or the mistress apothecary in order to lighten the pain. In the usual manner, the abbess refused in order to finally destroy with pain the one whom nature, if it had been helped a little more, would have wished to have been saved. She ordered that access to the said patient was to be given to no one except the person to whose custody she had been committed. The other dames, seeing that the life and health of their dearest sister were at the end of the rope, despite the foresaid matters, contrived a method of releasing the sick one from the foulest jail, since there was no deliverance for these wretched and afflicted ones other than to not hope for deliverance. Therefore, once she was carried off to the infirmary through the help of her own people, the lady abbess hastened to that place, and with the most wicked curse, she abused the sick one and the other helpers. And although she knew that the said patient had taken no food that day beyond some broth and wine, she commanded most severely that no food and drink should be brought to the sick one that day, which was observed absolutely by the hostile party, until the following day, when some neck and nothing else was offered to her around noon. From Tuesday until Sunday at lunch, nothing was presented which would please the palate of a sick person except broth, and that was wrested from Reverend Lady Abbess by importunate solicitation. After your most illustrious lordship, that's the nuncio, had expressly commanded them to take more diligent care of the patient, the doctor was called. When he had found that she had fallen into the jaws of death through hunger and fasting, he asked the reason that this had happened. Contrary to her knowledge, the interpreter responded that the patient rejected and scorned all food. Meanwhile, the mother infirmarian, roused by compassion, exerted herself to procure the things necessary for the patient's sustenance, and to receive no other praise and reward for her diligence and charity than the bitterest rebukes. And if the patient would have been more of an object of care to her than urgent necessity demanded, the said mother infirmarian would have withdrawn, so that she would not be unwillingly forced to see the patient dying for lack of the necessary things. When the other dames protested to the cellarer, as they call her, the person in charge of the kitchen provisions, that the health of the sick one should be an object of care to her, she responded that she could furnish nothing other than she had furnished so far, if she did not wish to incur the displeasure of the lady abbess, by whom she had been castigated several times with bitter words because of the minutest diligence employed toward the patient. The abbess attempted to diminish the extent of the said Dame Mary Wintour's illness, both among domestic servants and externs. Finally, when the said Dame Wintour expected that there would be no end of miseries and persecutions, the poor little one exclaimed with the prophet Job, "My soul is weary of my life. I left the limits of my dearest fatherland to consecrate myself to God. I bade farewell to the most esteemed family of my parents to devote the remainder of my life in poverty to holy religion. Did I deserve severity and enmities instead of kindness and friendship? What remains now except the grave, the end and period of all miseries and of the oppressions of my conscience? In the bitterness of my soul, I shall go to the gates of hell. And I lament the most unhappy course of the life that has passed, entreating a better death with all my petitions. And I entreat that you attend the remainder with holy prayers." And she perished during these dying words. What reason, pray, will the said abbess give to God for such wicked treatment and oppression of a dame who is from her fatherland and a religious comrade? What excuse will she foist on Saint Benedict, the defender and patron of the order, for having neglected his rule and statutes so badly? What causes will she exhibit for the incarceration perpetrated against dames who are her children? And the appellants go on. Percy's side, however, produced an attestation from the physician noting that Wintour died of natural causes. Furthermore, he stated, "I also attest that it was evident to me that the lady abbess was very solicitous on her behalf, and that she summoned 3 other doctors along with me so that there might be better care for her health. I also attest that I frequently came to her while she was afflicted with illness, and truly I heard no complaints from her. Although nevertheless other things, no matter how little, were mentioned to me at other times. Furthermore, I attest that when some medicines or other things were prescribed by me to alleviate disease, they were immediately employed. And finally, I attest that I visited the place in the monastery which they call the Tower, where the novices are accustomed to live, and I judge that it is healthy in every way, and that it is not injurious in any way to the health of those dwelling there." As the judicial process continued on throughout 1631 without any obvious end, things grew fraught within the convent, leading to a particularly violent outburst that October. As the nuncio proposed a settlement that seemed to favor the appellants, they were emboldened to disobey Percy's authority as abbess. Henry Vavasour, a secular priest and a brother of a key ringleader, had allegedly compared the monastery to a brothel, and Percy commanded Mary Phillips, our friend from the ward controversy, but now a sacristan and an appellant, to bar Vavasour from celebrating Mass. However, as Percy explained in an account sent to the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith, Phillips permitted that same man to celebrate the Mass, and she offered the wine and the cup to this same man for the purpose of performing it. And also, after the sacred rite, she allowed conversation with the nuns against my express prohibition. Therefore, not tolerating such great contempt of regular obedience, I assembled the religious who obey me, asking them what they judge should be prescribed concerning the force of disobedience. They all voted unanimously that she deserved suspension from office, especially since she had already been warned more than once about similar things previously committed in office. Therefore, I took the keys from her and I handed them over to another one of the religious. Meanwhile, the sacristan and her other allies occupied the sacristy, not without appearance of commotion and rebellion, and they keep it occupied even now. When the prioress entered it only in order to see which nuns and how many remained there, some of them surrounded her, and as 2 seized her by the head and shoulders and 2 also seized her by the feet, they insolently tossed her from the place. Her chest was somewhat wounded when they dragged her face down over the door sill, and finally they flung her onto her face on the ground when she could not even rise after some interval of time without another person's help. When the most illustrious nuncio was informed of these things, he was so far from rebuking them that it is said these things were interpreted as having been rightly done because they were carried out against me. How justly, however, judge you most eminent fathers. Against this backdrop, the Archbishop continued to receive pressure from various figures, including Cardinal Barberini, as well as Queen Henrietta Maria and the Infanta Isabella, to settle the dispute. The 2 parties finally came to an agreement on February 17, 1632, by which the appellants would give up their monastic offices and leave the monastery, taking a certain amount of funds and household goods. Yet this was far from the end of the story. As Percy's supporters reported to the Archbishop, the appellants were initially delighted by the settlement, until they spoke to an English Jesuit. At that point, they began to claim that they had not agreed to the settlement, that their interpreter had erred, and they refused to yield their monastic offices. Their Jesuit allies likely counseled this course of action because agreement to the settlement could have been seen as admitting culpability. Since the monastery now had 2 sets of monastic officers, great commotion resulted, particularly in the choir during services, a quasi-public place as the church was open to lay people who could hear but not see the nuns. As Percy's supporters recounted to the Archbishop, the first Saturday in the first week of Lent, Dame Martha began her office of chantress, in charge of the singing during the service. But Dame Maria would perforce intune the psalms with her, which she did in extraordinary and unaccustomed tunes of purpose, as it may seem, to make a discord, so that one part of the religious following the chantress and the other part Dame Maria, there was made an insupportable discord and confusion to the great scandal of those who were in the church, that's the public. The discord eventually became physical as the weeks passed, as Percy's supporters further related. The 21st of March being the feast of our Holy Father, that's St. Benedict, the convent being at matins in the choir, there was raised a great tumult, Dame Maria endeavoring with all her forces to have the upper hand in the appointment of the lessons, so that the divine office was left off for a time, and the religious betook them to strive and contend. The appellants would have thrust out of the choir those of my lady's side, and coming also to the prioress who sat in her seat, pulled her book out of her hand and bid her to go out of the choir, using unto her very contumelious words. And Dame Mary Evers especially, who at last, as it were to provoke her, said unto her, "Strike, strike if you dare, strike if you dare." In this contention, Dame Flavia fell to the ground, but by what means it is not known, whether her foot might slip as she was earnest in striving, or whether thrown down by any of the appellants who were nearer unto her than Dame Marina, whom they accused to have thrown her down. But Dame Marina is so certain that she did not do it, that she will take her oath upon it. For their part, the appellants informed the Archbishop around this time that many acts of violence have been tendered to us by the other party, not solely by Mother Priors, but by several others, even the youngest of all, namely tearing the books and papers out of our hands, overturning the pulpits, pushing us and drawing us forcibly out of our seats, putting out the candles, casting them with the candelabras to the ground with great tumult and scandalous disorder. Some of us were struck in the choir. One of our habits was torn. And on the feast of our glorious Father St. Benedict, Dame Flavia, whilst she was reading a lesson from Matins, was forcibly cast to the floor by Dame Marina with such force that she immediately vomited blood and continues still with a great sickness of the chest and is very weakened as a result of this fall. These acts of violence are ordinarily accompanied by very exasperating words. At this point, Easter was approaching. and the Archbishop had to act so that these disturbances did not occur on that crucial feast day. As a result, on April 6, 1632, just days before Easter, Archbishop Boonen decreed that the appellants must be removed from the convent. The appellants subsequently complained to Cardinal Barberini that their removal was carried out in an inhumane and shameful manner. As they relate, in the dead of night on that same day of Holy Week, by the Archbishop's mandate, approximately 10 officers of the law, of that number who customarily lead infamous whores to prison, after the doors of the holy enclosure were violated, burst in with rifles and swords, and without any priest or Catholic man as a leader who might set a limit on their ferocity. Furiously, they ordered the 6 aforesaid nuns to leave without interposing any delay, although some had just now been woken from sleep and were not yet dressed. The officers took the nuns by force, and tumultuously they urged them to depart. They dragged and carried them off, and finally their fury reached the point that they also removed 2 nuns who had not been included in that mandate, one of whom was without clothing and could not manage to cover herself. Until this horrible tragedy was complete, nothing was heard except the wretched wailings of the religious who shouted "Mercy! Mercy!" continuously everywhere they could, to such an extent that after lights were set out and bells were ringing, the whole street was awoken on both sides, and the entire neighborhood stood at its windows, plainly astonished and stupefied by the nuns' very sorrowful lamentations. In contrast, Champney provided a very different description of their ejection to a friend in Rome. It is told me that Master Wintour hath sent thither most false informations, and in particular that some of the nuns were trailed out upon the ground half naked, being taken out of their beds, all which is most false, for neither were in their beds at all, nor were they trailed or dragged, but went out upon their feet, 2 or 3 gentlewomen English, and some of their kinswomen accompanying them, all of them in their accustomed habits. If you hear anything contrary to this, say boldly it is false, as if need be, it shall be proved to the confusion of the authors of the contrary. This, of course, is not the end of the nuns' story. They would continue to appeal until they were restored to the house in restricted quarters, and then finally reintegrated under obedience to Percy in 1641, a year before her death. There's much more that I could say, but I will begin to end here with the words of Anne Healy, one of the lay sisters who objected to Champney, because I think they express what lay at the heart of these disputes: salvation. For both parties, nothing less than their vocations and the security of their souls were at stake. I desire nothing, she says, but the performance of my vocation. I seek no new thing, but what I found in practice when I entered this monastery and what it enjoyed above 20 years. I accepted, or I made an exception against putting my soul under the charge of a secular priest only, by a particular brief when I was to be religious, as some yet living can testify. I contented not myself with the strength of my statutes newly confirmed at my entrance, but before I took the habit, informed myself of the stability and immutability of these spiritual privileges, benefits, and directions, which then I found in this convent. And I received absolute assurance and a particular promise of my Lady Abbess, then Joan Barclay, and Father Chambers, that during their lives there should be no changes, and according to their understanding, there could never be any, because now the statutes was confirmed by authority from the See Apostolic, from Rome, the Pope. I have made a promise like unto a vow in public before my profession not to admit any greater liberty than I found. And I see these alterations to have made such a declination and decay of regularity and religion as that this house is quite another thing than it was at my coming. The only cause why I chose this monastery was the name it had of perfection and spirituality above others. And therefore also I undertook this estate of a converse sister, refusing the offers that was made of me of being of the choir in 2 other places, at Louvain and Douay. And when Dame Lucy Natchbull and the other religious went from hence to begin at Gaunt, they offered me to go with them, whereupon I conferred with my present Lady Abbess, that's Percy, concerning my assurance of having the society here, the want whereof could only cause me to remove. And she assured me that whilst she lived, I nor the monastery should want them, and therefore I refused to go with these religious. Now, to be thus deceived, and to have the best part of my estate withdrawn and annihilated, as the spiritual exercise in some others, and turn into a wearisome drudgery thereby, is intolerable, and not to be endured by me. Wherefore, in case your lordship will not or cannot, in respect of my lady's opposition, reduce this monastery to its former felicity in the spiritual privileges and comfort of the society's assistance, I do most humbly and in as earnest manner as I can beseech your grace to permit my removal to another monastery and give me leave to labor the effecting thereof. For I cannot in conscience lose my labor in living in such disunion, unquietness, and insecurity as is here. No, my Lord, believe me, speaking the truth in the presence of Almighty God, my heart shall sooner lose its heat and change its place than this resolution of serving our Lord according to the vocation he gave me and the practice and intention wherein I vowed. As Healy's words indicate, the disturbances at Brussels demonstrate these women's staunch commitment to fight for their Catholic faith and, by implication, the future of their country, a commitment that had already led them to leave their native land and that then prompted them to take increasingly desperate actions. Of course, the same commitment also motivated Percy and her supporters to defend their own stance. However history may judge the participants' actions, the appellants were ultimately the victors. Mary Vavasour, a key ringleader, became abbess in 1652 and finally quelled the controversies. She recalled a few years before her death that, as amongst saints, contradictions will sometimes rise. So in this holy community, some differences arising, there was some opposition made against the statutes. But the greatest part of the community stood for them. And we then made our humble recourse to His Holiness and the Sacred Congregation for the defense of our statutes. And God be praised, the Holy See always protected us. But yet in that time we suffered much, but God assisted us and all concluded happily. As my talk today has shown, there's much more to this episode than simple opposition to the statutes. And we have much to learn from recovering these nuns' lost voices. Thank you.